Okay, I'm going to introduce you. That's okay. Everybody, this is Dr. Greg Peters. He's a professor at Chalmers, Chalmers University or Chalmers Institute of Technology, something
University
like
of Technology.
University of Technology in Sweden. And he does a lot of research in clothing and sustainability, and not just clothing sustainability, but that's one of the topics he covers. He's a professor of quantitative sustainability assessment at Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden's industrial capital, Gothenburg. His research is aimed at expanding the application of sustainability assessment tools and improving their accuracy. Recent research projects relate to the clothing, water, and agricultural and chemical industries, the regulatory sector, and the fate of nitrogen discharges. He also teaches life cycle assessment and environmental science to university students and delivers consulting services to industrial and, may I say, religious clients. So go ahead, Greg.
Very good. I'm just going to turn on my little pointer thingy if I can find it. Or perhaps you can you see my mouse if I point like this? There we go. Yeah. That'll probably do me. I'm used to running on two screens. I've only got one here at home on Sunday night. So we'll go with this. All right. Yes. Well, look, thank you for that introduction, David. It's a pleasure to be here or there or wherever I am in cyberspace at the moment. I guess I'm part of a group of people that have been interested in the sustainability of different industrial sectors for some time, and found we had some tools we could apply to the fashion sector. So it was great when a big project on that came up recently. So let's see if we can just get this to move forward. Yes, we can. Okay. So this is what I'll be looking at today. What's the problem? What solutions do we have? And will circularity save us? Whatever that is. We'll come back to more on that. So the basic problem I think we have here is that the production of textiles has overtaken our need for them. When I was a kid, 50% of the textiles we were using were cotton. And cotton is limited by the available irrigation water for it. I mean, there are only certain places we can grow cotton, and in those places it's also competing with the production of food. So there are physical limits on how much we can make. Recently, China's been making less of it. People have talked about the possibility that we reached peak cotton in 2007. Well, India's producing a bit more, and it remains to be seen whether Monsanto's GMO cotton can outwit the pink bollworm in the long term. But there's, let's just say, challenges to how much cotton we can produce. On the other hand, there's not really any natural limit to how much polyester we can produce. And polyester production has really only been held back by demand for the stuff. Well, the fashion industry has removed that barrier, you could say. Starting in the late 90s, a company called Zara is particularly mentioned in this context. They pioneered the use of shorter development cycles for garments. And they cut a few corners on quality and on environmental matters on the way there. But they, and then others that jumped on the same bandwagon like H&M, Hennes & Mauritz, were able to outmaneuver the competition and produce new looks quicker than others, and basically listen to customers and discover what was hot and what was not, and take over the market in a bigger and bigger way. So that was the beginning of fast fashion. And you can see, if you look at this graph, something happens around about the late 90s, 2000, where instead of textile production tracking the population of the planet, it goes off on a completely different direction. If we focus in now, let's say on that last 20 years or so, since 2000, we need to press forwards. Boom. Here's a figure I borrowed from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. You can see that the amount of items that we're producing per person, it's gone up. It's pretty much doubled over that period. And the number of times we use those garments is going down. I don't have statistics for the United States, but I imagine the Swedish statistics aren't vastly different. The average Swede buys 7 t-shirts a year, uses them once a week for about 6 months, and then it's game over. Now, that's an average. So there are people who are doing better than that, and there are people who are doing a lot worse. There are people who buy a garment, take a picture of it on themselves for Facebook or Instagram, and then the garment's life is done. It goes in the bin, because the whole purpose was just to show off on social media. So some things get used much less than they could be. This is a problem. Nothing comes for free. You can see here a bunch of different textiles. This isn't looking at garments here, but different textiles. And each of them has its problems. I often get asked the question, what's the best fiber? What's the most sustainable fiber? And I think it's kind of missing the point in a way. All fibers have a problem. You can see there, cotton, of course, is well known to be a real drinker of water. So that's a problem with cotton. But polyester is surprisingly energy intensive by comparison. And wool, wool has this incredible greenhouse footprint. And that's partly because of the energy consumption associated with cleaning up greasy wool and the wet processing, involves heating and drying and heating and drying, but also to a large extent the enteric methane. In other words, the amount of burping and farting that sheep do. So they're releasing methane that way, which is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. And that ruins the story for wool. So, yeah, all of these things are associated with problems, greenhouse gases being one in particular. Another, which I would mention in this point, is the potential toxicity of the chemicals in use. Now, this is a very complicated table, and I don't want you to feel like you have to understand everything in it. But basically, it was a hazard assessment, which one of my PhD students did, for the chemicals we use to waterproof garments. So if you buy a Gore-Tex jacket, for example, part of the waterproofing is delivered by a membrane, but it's also partly the chemicals that are sprayed on the outside, which help to keep usually the polyester weave dry so that the membrane can breathe. So you don't feel sweaty inside it because the water has been shed off the outside on account of these chemicals. And there are different possible chemicals you can use. For a long time, we've been using fluorinated side chain polymers, as they're called. You see PFOA up there. You may have heard about that in the news. But PFOA is being banned because, much like DDT a generation ago, it's a chemical which is a forever chemical. Bacteria, it doesn't know how to break it down. It's a chemical, once we release it, it's going to stay in the environment pretty much forever. And that's why it has this over here for P, this is persistence. It's a very high risk of persistence with that. But so are most of these other chemicals here, which are alternative to it. A lot of people started using shorter versions of PFOA, this Perfexa and PFBS. And people try to use silicones. They're also extremely long-lived. So we've got some problems here. The other problem, which really what I want you to have for the take-home message from this slide is, look at the number of times DG is here in a box. Data gap. When me and my colleagues are trying to find out what chemicals are being used to waterproof garments, we encounter a lot of resistance from the chemical industry. We actually were offered a jar of stuff to try some experiments with. And we were told, if you do any tests on this to find out what's in it, we'll sue you. We had to use the jar as it was. And, we're academic researchers. If we can't find out what's in the jar, don't think anyone else is going to. So there's a whole lot of uncertainty around some of these things. And that's a problem. So this has all been very sort of numbers and letters and colors, but the impacts of all of this, of the impacts of the fashion industry are now plainly obvious to many people. That lake in the top left there is called the Aral Sea. And that's a picture that was taken quite some time ago now, because if you look on the right, that's how it looks today. The Aral Sea used to be the fourth biggest freshwater lake in the world. It's a little bit to the east of the Caspian Sea in Central Asia. But so much of the water has been sucked out of it, or really prevented from entering it for the purpose of irrigating cotton, that it's basically disappeared. You can see there are some dudes walking past a fishing boat with not a fish in sight. So this is having real impacts. And it's not just the Aral Sea. I mean, you can think, oh, that's far away, but this happens wherever we grow cotton. I mean, in my old country, the mighty Murray, as it's called, the Murray River, which is the biggest in the country, it often doesn't reach the sea anymore. And that's because people grow cotton in Queensland, which is the headwaters of the Darling River that feed into it. So this is a problem all over the world. Not just the water use, but the amount of waste being produced. A lot of this ends up in different places. In Sweden, we tend to burn it. Of course, if it's polyester, then we're making carbon dioxide emissions go into the atmosphere. In other countries, it can end up in landfill. A lot of used textiles also end up being shipped to poorer countries where they can wipe out the local textile industry. That's one of the complaints against European countries, sending used textiles down to Africa. So there's a lot of effects there. And also, if a lot of the material isn't even usable and ends up being burnt under environmentally dangerous conditions that could release a lot of soot into the atmosphere. I mentioned chemistry, of course, and this is a picture from China from a place called the Yellow River, except it isn't, is it? This is a place called Lanzhou. I'm not pronouncing it right probably, but it's in China, and the Yellow River, as you can see, is pink. That's on account of all of the dyes going into it. So we've got some issues here. I go on about water, but water is a big deal. I mean, it's easy to think there's enough water around when you live in a wealthy country, or one like Sweden with lots of rain, which is also a wealthy country. But you know, people suffer in violent conflicts on account of competition for water, and it's a big deal. So how do you change something that has these problems when it's this big? One of the challenges with dealing with the fashion industry and attempting to improve it is that it is this globalized system. And it would typically be the case if you want to change the way your next shirt is made, typically you will need to find the retailers, contractors, subcontractor, who will be most likely a person in Bangladesh or China. So you will need to speak a different language. And all of these processes are distributed across the planet. So it's very difficult for us to say, I want to change this bit and press a button and get a change. Indeed, there were a lot of companies that were quite shocked to find out in 2013, when the Rana Plaza disaster occurred, that their workers were trapped under the concrete. They didn't know they had any there. This was a building in Bangladesh, which, well, it wasn't being looked after properly, and there were lots of people in there and lots of vibration from machines operating, and a terrible thing happened there. But suddenly a whole lot of United States and European clothing giants realized they had a problem they didn't know existed. So they didn't even know where their people were. It's a big industry. And one of the reasons why we don't know much about it, I think, is because of this globalization that has occurred. I mentioned this in some of my remarks before we started, that the textile and fashion industry is relatively late on the scene. I call this my Korg 40,000 BC graph because it shows the publications connected with what are the 4 basic human physical needs, I would say: food, clothing, water, and shelter. And if you want to do a life cycle assessment, which is something I do a lot of, it helps if you've got industry interested, because a lot of the data we need to do our analysis about the sustainability of products and processes, it comes from the companies themselves being interested in sharing with us and perhaps even helping to finance some of the work. So these rate at which you see publications on a particular topic is, to me, a barometer of how interested the industry is in talking to academics and helping us find out stuff about how to improve. And as you can see there, the water industry has played an important role, as have architectural and construction industries, and the food sector gone in a little bit later. But it seems as if the textile industry, or the fashion industry, is really, it's a decade late off the block here, deciding to do something about sustainability. Because, you know, as some of the big retailers might say, it's not my problem. It's happening in Bangladesh or somewhere else. So, yeah, this is why it's perhaps not been on the radar until relatively recently. You can see that it does seem now that people are getting more interested, and indeed textile companies, fashion companies are getting more interested in this. So this is the good news. Stuff is starting to happen. Now, what do we find out from this type of work? Well, I'm glad to share some results here. Now, naturally, because a lot of the work I've done has been funded by the Swedish taxpayer, the results I'll show here will be particularly relevant to Swedish and European consumption, and I will try and point out where I think North American consumption might be significantly different. But on this topic, I think this particular figure is probably fairly universal. As I say, like most of the cotton being grown is coming from places where there's a shortage of water, and most of the production is overseas for both Americans and Swedes and Europeans. So what we've done here is look at all of the water that goes into the whole life cycle of a garment, starting with making the fibers, putting them together into yarn, turning that into fabric, dyeing it, putting it together. Confectioning is what they call when they sew garments together, transporting it and getting it to a user. Of course, a user has to wash the clothes. And you might think that that bar there would be enormous because we wash clothes with lots of water. But the point here is that if you are using water in a situation where there's plenty of it, it doesn't cause as much water stress. There's not as much impact of that water being used. So it really is not a big deal in this figure. So this shows us that, you know, if you wanted to try and deal with the impacts of using fashion, wearing clothes on the water cycle, you wouldn't worry so much about your laundry as the place where the garment came from, or particularly the place where the fiber, the cotton, came from. Let me move us on a little bit here, if I can. There we go. I need to press that again. All right. Here's some other results. Now, this is a graph that shows you about the carbon footprint, in other words, the climate impact, and the energy use of those same phases. And I apologize for the colors. We had some, what are they called? Graphical designers working with us in this project, and they insisted on these colors. But I think you can probably see them clear enough despite the background. So the pink there, that's the carbon footprint, and the whatever that is, khaki is the energy use. And you can see what seems to be a fairly sort of similar relationship between these two bars in most cases, except particularly the use phase here in the laundry. So this comes back to a point where I should point out one of the differences, key differences between the US and Sweden in particular. In Sweden, we get approximately 2% of our electricity from fossil fuels. About half of it comes from hydroelectricity, and there's a bit of nuclear and a whole lot of wind power. The carbon footprint of a kilowatt hour of electricity you buy here is around about 13 grams per kilowatt hour. The United States, I read a figure the other day of 450 grams. So you're using about 30 times more carbon to get the electricity you use than the Swede does. So what that means in terms of this graph is here, well, this pink bar would be, up like the other ones for consumption in the United States. But as for this stuff on the left here, I think it would probably be pretty much the same kind of pattern. And that's one of the important messages here. You can see that there's so much going on here on the left-hand side of this graph. Roughly 80% of the greenhouse impacts and of the energy consumption is happening before the garment gets to you. Before it's even, before you buy it in the shop, the image or the damage is done. Okay, so this is really useful information, I think, when we come to the question of, well, what should we do? What can I, Joe or Joanne, consumer, do to reduce my impacts? Most obviously, keep your wallet shut. If you don't buy the garments, if the garments are not being made for you because you're wearing them longer, wearing them as long as we used to wear only 20 years ago, then we reduce the impact significantly of our total consumption of textiles. Okay, so that's what happens in this first bar here. If we just double the amount of time we're getting out of our garments and therefore not buying as much, we can really quickly reduce the carbon footprint of our consumption. Another possibility is that we swap energy supplies for the systems that provide us with our garments. And that's something that happily is happening. It's not something you can easily choose as a consumer, but all over the world, people are discovering it's actually cheaper to gather wind power than to burn coal. We're sort of at a turning point, it seems, just on the pure economics of it. And so that has a capacity to also further reduce the impact here. One of the funny things to my mind, one of the surprising bits of this research was when we looked at the amount of effort it takes to get the garment back to your home. You can see here on this graph, use phase transports, we called it here. And that's not an insignificant part of the total picture. Just the effort of you going to the shop and back in your car, as a lot of people will, is a big part of the total impact of the garment life cycle. So if we're able to do that, let's say by walking or taking a bicycle or something, we could significantly improve the outcomes. So these are the sort of top 3 measures that seem to suggest themselves in the work we've done. Now, I'm expecting someone to say, what about recycling? People do that here a lot. Recycling is an interesting option here, particularly for the waste management. But does it help us with climate change, you might ask? Well, we need to be clear what we mean by recycling. There's a lot of things we can do with garments over here on the left, which are not strictly speaking recycling so much as reuse. And we've done a little bit of work on those, looking at something called clothing libraries, where you don't actually own clothes, but you borrow them like you would borrow a book from a library. And this is a little bit marginal at the moment, but it's kind of an interesting idea. We could do more of that, but we just need to make sure we don't increase the transport impacts, which showed themselves to be potentially significant when it comes to what consumers do. So I've published a study on that, which goes into that in more detail. My colleagues and I also spent some time looking at this longer loop here. back to what we would call monomer recycling, where rather than just breaking down garments and extracting the fabric, or breaking them down and extracting the fibers and respinning them, we actually break the fibers all the way back down to their individual chemical units and respin them. So this is perhaps the other end of the scale, and something which might be useful to deal with the mountains of waste we get. Because most of the stuff we have in circulation at the moment, it's not really, circulation is the wrong word. Most of the garments that are used end up being landfilled or incinerated. It's only a tiny amount of the total flow. You see this little loop up here, less than 1% of the stuff that gets made ends up coming back and being turned back into garments again. Most of the recycling that happens is garments being ripped up and turned into insulation, either noise insulation or thermal insulation. That's at the top of the picture there. There's a lot of bottles being turned into fleece material. That's this 2% coming in here, but it's not garment to garment recycling. So that's not going to change the world in an enormous way. Still useful to do, but yeah, let's not call it textile recycling, it's bottle recycling. Okay, I'm doing for time. I probably need to get a little move on here. So we decided to look at that in more detail, the idea of trying to get that less than 1% up to something a little bit more serious. And I was responsible for the environmental assessment of a process developed here at Chalmers University in Sweden for the recycling of mixed textiles, because that's really the key problem here. The textile waste is so cheap and the new fibers are so cheap. There's really not much value in it in a capitalist society. There's not much point from a company's point of view to try and make new polyester or new fiber of other sorts out of it. So we thought, well, could we try and make the process cheaper by making it more effective? And this is where we ended up in terms of the textiles, in terms of the carbon footprint of this textile recycling process. And I won't give you too much detail on this, but what you're looking at here is a graph of what the carbon footprint is of 4 alternative scenarios. So if we say this second column here, this is if you've got a cotton polyester garment and used it once. Over here, we've got a viscose. So viscose is a sort of a tree-based version of cotton, if you like. So that's got a larger carbon footprint because of the effort of turning trees into something like cotton. This recycling process we were looking at that recycled all of the cotton and as much of the cotton and as much of the polyester as we could from that sort of garment, ended up having a higher carbon footprint. A lot of this was this black bar here, which is about trying to recycle the polyester. And we thought, well, okay, what if we just forget about the polyester and just recycle the cotton? Then it goes down quite a lot. But it's still not, fantastic. It's not like we've reduced the carbon footprint massively by doing this. In a way, this comparison is a bit unfair because what you're looking at on the left here are processes which have existed for decades and thousands of people have tried to improve them and make them more efficient. Whereas the stuff on the right here is laboratory scale work. We scaled up and it's all quite new. This could get better. But I don't think this is, so I think this is worth doing and investing in, but it's not going to solve all the world's climate problems. It's a slightly better picture when you look at water. The water use associated with recycling is significantly less than the water use associated with making new cotton garments. So there we seem to be backing a winner. Although again, should the comparison be made with cotton or with viscose? I think that's something we didn't feel we could definitively say, because if we make more viscose-like fabric, are we really going to stop people growing cotton in India? I doubt it. So maybe we should be comparing with a viscose polyester blend, in which case, well, we're worse off with the recycling. So anyway, this is preliminary, if you like. We could make this recycling processes better, but they're not going to solve all their problems. And I guess that's the message I wanted to give to you about recycling is, yeah, let's work on it for all sorts of good reasons, but we need to do a whole lot of other things if we're going to solve the problems that fast fashion creates. So I would wrap up then here by saying a couple of things. I guess my overall message then is that the fashion industry has overgrown. It's, to my mind, twice as big as it needs to be. And that's because we go along with what it's offering, and we've participated in it for many years. This is causing massive and unnecessary impacts on the Earth's ecosystems and resources. And happily, people are starting to be concerned about this. I'm very pleased you guys invited me to talk, because I mean, that's a sign of this happening. We need to do more. And recycling is probably not perfect, but it could do something. It has improvement potential, but let's not imagine that it's going to do everything for us that we need to happen. Yeah, that's a detailed point, perhaps. If we're going to do recycling, it's really about trying to make the cotton like fiber in a better way than we do currently. Seems to be where the improvement potential is. But the quickest and best and fastest thing you can do is to just buy less new clothing. I mean, there's a whole lot of, there's some studies in Europe that show that 10% of the clothing people buy, they lose in the back of their wardrobes, you know? And so I'm sure it's probably similar in the US. I mean, I've discovered old things I didn't know I had. Unfortunately, some caterpillars found some of them first, but you know, there's stuff at the back there that you could pull out and use. That's it's got potential. So that's the end of, I mean, I think I've been rather the advocate here as well as the academic, but if I can just be really into the advocacy here for a second, I guess you might recognize this picture of England's most famous former prince. But what I want to draw your attention to is his shoe. There's his shoe down there. Here it is blown up a little bit bigger. Notice it's got a hole in the sole. Okay. And that's because he likes the shoe. He can afford another shoe, but he likes this shoe. It's his favorite. All right. Here's another important person you may recognize, one of the most popular former presidents of an African nation. And here he is kicking a ball at some sort of African National Congress meeting, I think it was, some years back. And whoops, off goes the shoe. And everyone thinks that's very funny. Oh, and look, he's wearing a sock with a giant hole in it. Okay. And when he did this, people didn't say, oh, what a silly guy, he's wearing socks with holes. And they didn't necessarily say this about this prince either. In both cases, it really helped people warm to these people and say, well, you know, these are real guys. They could afford better, but they're wearing what they like. And so this is perhaps my my leaving message to you. If princes and presidents can wear holes in public, you don't need new clothes either. Well, that's it for me. There's a bunch of papers if you want to get more into the academic research, and I guess I'm happy to provide any of these to anyone who wants, but that's it for me. Thank you for listening.
Greg, that was wonderful. Thank you. That was very informative. Let's open it up to questions.
I'm very curious about the end of life for the clothing. You mentioned that the US ends up shipping it to poor countries. What should we be, as citizens, be advocating for instead? I mean, obviously, we should all be not wearing and therefore throwing away so much different stuff. But what should we do until we can convince everyone to stop buying and throwing away? What should we advocate be done with clothing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, I think probably to wear clothing longer is actually the quickest thing we can do. And that trying to find alternative ways to deal with the waste, that will be that will be slower. But I suppose the broader question of what should we do with the waste, I think we should continue investigating methods for recycling it. And I think ideally it'd be good if countries took care of their own wastes rather than well, dumping them on other countries. And I would stress, I don't know exactly what happens to the waste in the United States. I know that a lot of European waste ends up in countries like Nigeria and other places in the western parts of Africa.
Family.
So that's certainly a problem that Europe needs to deal with its waste. But I think it'd be good if we found better uses for it, and so if we can perhaps dissolve it, that's an interesting thing to do. We've had some other research that showed that when you use cotton many times, for example, eventually what's happening to the cotton, I mean, you'll notice that let's say a cotton bed sheet gets thinner and thinner, and that's partly the fibers sort of coming out of the weave and disappearing. But even the fiber that's left there is damaged. There's little breaks in the actual polymer that occur over time and through tumble drying and so forth. So the actual fiber becomes weaker. This is why it's interesting to dissolve it back to just polymers or monomers and respin new fiber from that, because you end up getting back to a strong fiber. There are companies, certainly some Spanish companies leading this charge, that are getting old textiles, shredding them and spinning fiber from that. So they're recycling, let's say, fiber rather than polymers and monomers. So they're taking fibers and spinning it back into a new thread. That stuff is never going to be as strong as something that's been taken all the way back to the chemical units that it's built up, the polymers and monomers. So it's important to keep looking at those processes.
Hi, everyone.
Something else I would add there is that if we can learn to wash things the amount they need to be washed rather than the amount many people do, we will get more life out of them. So, for example, there have been some studies that suggest in some households, something dropped on the floor, a garment accidentally dropped on the floor, can't end up back in the cupboard unless it goes through a washing machine. Okay, that garment hasn't been worn, it's got no sweat in it, might have a little bit of dirt or dust you could shake off. But people wash things perhaps every weekend, even if the garment they wore that week really didn't get that dirty. So a lot of our washing behavior is driven by habit rather than need. So if we wash our garments the amount they need rather than in excess, we damage the fibers less and we can get longer use out of them. The garments will survive for longer.
I'm interested in you said that there were some companies that were beginning to get the gravity of the situation. I'd like to know what they were doing. I was thinking, one of the reasons at least females buy clothes, besides just, an aesthetic that changes every 2 years, is that their contours change every so often. And so I'm wondering, are any companies, designing sort of garments with that you can, adjust to fit a different shape. I mean, I know people who have bought several wardrobes because they keep losing and gaining weight. Now, I don't know.
Yeah. I dare say, and I'm not an expert on exactly what the trends are in that way, but I would say that that's a good solution, and also a reason to think about clothing libraries, because with a clothing library, you can, if you change shape, you go back a month later and you swap the things that you borrowed and get things that fit you better. So that's another way of approaching it. As you say, you could design garments which are more adjustable, either more elastic or with adjustable straps or something, or you could just have a bigger wardrobe that encompasses more sizes that you don't actually own yourself. Yeah. Hello, Barbara.
You were talking about clothing libraries. As I was losing a lot of weight, I would buy my jeans at Goodwill for $5. And as I would lose weight, I would get another size and then send in the pair, wash them, of course, and give the pair to the Goodwill again for someone else. So it was kind of a lending library with a little fee in there. So
Yeah,
I was trying to
yeah.
do.
And that's probably the way. I think that will work better for from a business point of view, maybe from a consumer point of view, because not everyone's ready for a clothing library, and the places I know of where they exist, they tend to be a little bit experimental and a little bit subsidized by city governments. But the idea that Goodwill, I guess that's a sort of a charity used garment shop in this case. Those things have a tried and true business model, and one way to recycle is essentially to own the garment, but perhaps for a shorter period of time than we would otherwise. So yeah, that's a good solution.
You said something about H&M early on, and just had a question about them because my son has all of a sudden been very into buying things from them. Is it because their clothing is pretty cheap, and I'm assuming it's cheaply made and probably doesn't last as long? So is it better then to buy much more expensive clothing that you can wear for 10 years?
Well, I would say yes, and I think H&M probably is having it a bit each way. They've got some work on sustainability, which is very interesting, but they're also still a supplier of a lot of very inexpensive garments that are not likely to be worn very long. But I think if you spend twice as much and get a garment you wear twice as long, then you've done the environment a service, most likely.
I was thinking of our church's thrift shop when someone mentions rebuying things, and we do a lot of work with clothing that gets recycled.
Yeah, that's great.
And it's interesting that we get lots more women's clothing than men's. So we can see probably that women are more responsible for the environmental costs than men.
Yeah. I mean, certainly in Sweden, it's the 15 to 35 female segment, which results in the most turnover here. Men, I don't know. I can't speak for all men, but I don't really enjoy clothes shopping, so I don't do it unless I have to. But I think it's a much more important activity for young women than for old men.
Do you know if any of the magazines, women's magazines, have ever featured this issue? I'm thinking.
Oh, yeah, probably. I mean, I don't read women's magazine, but I think that I did see some interesting. Talking about media, I caught a train the other day, and it was a long distance train, a bit like in an airplane. There's a magazine from the service provider, and it had an advertisement from a Swedish company called Fjällräven, which is really a company that produces a lot of outdoor clothing. So if you want to go skiing or bushwalking or hiking, then you might well buy one of their products. And they were making a thing they were making a point about the fact that you might only ever need to buy their jacket once. And they had a picture of somebody's jacket, one of their jackets from, I think, 1980. This was in 2020, that somebody was still wearing. And so they were making a sales point. They actually referred to one of the reports that my team wrote. So I was very proud of that. In the footer, they were pointing out the benefits of the long life of a garment. So I'm very happy that at least that market segment has taken the lead on some of these things. I mentioned fluorinated organic chemicals for waterproofing outdoor gear, and it's, you know, there are a number of outdoor companies that have decided to get rid of the fluorinated organics and focus on other kinds of waterproofing chemicals. So I guess if your market segment is A, expensive stuff people wear to survive in the bush, and B, people who are in the bush because they care about the environment and they like being there, then you're most likely to lead the sustainability charge for the whole fashion sector. But there are a lot of other companies, you know, still selling, you know, $5 t-shirts or whatever it is that that don't really give a damn and are just following the dollar. And the only way to change those people, I think, is for us consumers to change our behavior.
Is it better to buy clothes that are made in like the US or Sweden or something? Can you assume that they're using more sustainable practices or not?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's kind of risky territory for me to try and go to. I don't have a strong opinion about the national origins of clothing. I think that, I mean, there are people working for low wages in a lot of wealthy countries, and you know, oftentimes the textile industry has sought out the cheapest place to make those things, whether they're being made in the US or being made in another country. I mean, in Sweden, you know, we have free healthcare and we have paid maternity leave and a few other things, and we don't make any textiles, you know, because it's too expensive. So most of the garments here are coming from like I say, Bangladesh and China, where industrial conditions are very different. I know that I've heard anyway that the US is experiencing a bit of a renaissance in its textile production, partly because of disruptions, partly because Chinese labor is becoming more expensive. So, you know, there's the possibility of production moving back to the US. But I think, you know, you should keep a good eye on how it's being made over there and whether the people have, you know, a proper health insurance and paternity leave or maternity leave, and make sure that people are looked after.
One more question. If someone has one. Greg, I want to thank you. That was just terrific. More than we could have hoped for, really. And I'm an academic, and I can tell you that for somebody to ask you to give a talk to church people on Sunday evening is not really a job description. So let's all give Greg a great hand. That was fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Great. Greg, feel free to email me with any questions or et cetera, et cetera. All right.
Okay. Well, look, it was nice talking to you people. I hope you have a great rest of the day.